I'm Craig Winn, and this is a news edition of the YAHOWAH blog. Yesterday was an extraordinary day for the United States, particularly for a president and the White House. And on this portion of the YAHOWAH blog, I want to address one of the two greatest threats to the world today. The one I'm not going to discuss at this moment, but I at least want you to be cognizant of it, is that there is the myth that there is a Palestinian people who have been robbed of their homeland and that Israel must either be eliminated or move someplace else in the world. So these mythological people known as the Palestinians can have a state of their own. It is one of the most diabolical deceptions ever perpetrated on the majority of people worldwide. And the consequence of this deception will likely lead to World War III. There is another deception, however, that is equally likely to ignite World War III. And it is the one that we saw play out yesterday in the White House. This is the first day of March of 2025. The meeting was between Vice President Vance, President Trump, and President Zelensky of Ukraine. And for the world to see, I'll just briefly recap that meeting, and then I want to tell you the truth so that you know what led up to it, because it is one of the most perplexing things I think I have ever encountered in reporting news, and I have been doing this now for well over 20 years. I've had a number of talk radio programs, one where I was the host of Shattering Myths, where I discussed the news 5 days a week, sometimes 6, and have been on, well, as many as 10,000 radio programs. So I've done this for a long time. And I think that the myth of how the Ukrainian-Russian war was started and why it exists today is one of the most misunderstood of, well, maybe of the last 100 years. So I do want to discuss it. But before we get into it, the Oval Office meltdown yesterday. As I understand it, and I have now listened to a long-form interview on CNN where the host was obnoxious and Secretary of State Rubio was really extraordinarily articulate. And he explained what transpired before this meeting, where Zelensky had assured him that the mineral rights deal would be approved, and that actually it had been approved by the Ukrainian government. But Zelensky chose not to sign it. He wanted that showdown that he got in the Oval Office. The purpose of the mineral deal that Trump anticipated, which was the only reason for the Zelensky meeting, was not to pay for additional additional weapons from the United States to fund the war. It was so that the United States would have a vital interest in Ukraine, and because it has a vital interest in Ukraine, that would protect Ukraine from any further, let's use the word aggression for right now, from Russia, because United States interest would therefore be at stake. And it was a way of having the United States involved in Ukraine without having Ukraine be part of NATO or positioning U.S. weapons in Ukraine, which for Russia would be exactly as the U.S. responded during the Kennedy administration when it was learned that the Russians had put nuclear weapons in Cuba. And what we'll find is that this whole episode in Ukraine is nothing more than the Cuban Missile Crisis played by idiots this time. It's a repeat of it, but with very different results. Anyway, That agreement was not to buy more American weapons, which I had originally assumed it was, but instead it was to have the United States involved with Ukraine in a way that was not going to be draining financially for America, would not be draining for the Ukrainians, would be a mutual partnership, but would have the U.S. involved in a way that was not militaristic and therefore not threatening to Russia. And it was a way to avoid putting the Ukraine as part of NATO, which would be a disaster for the world. It would immediately lead to World War III. And so when Zelensky wouldn't sign the agreement and the prior discussions to the televised meltdown, what he wanted instead is to see if he could outwit the U.S. president and play on America's ignorance of how this war began and the state of affairs in the Ukraine, such that he could get the United States to either invest in more weapons for the Ukraine, send troops to the Ukraine, or assure that the Ukraine would be part of NATO, whereby it would be known that should that be the case, then if there was a war between Russia and Ukraine, then it would have to be a war between the United States and Russia, which of course would have nuclear consequences, which is why it's one of the dumbest things imaginable. And so when the intent of the meeting, the whole preamble and the pretext of the meeting as communicated through Secretary of State Rubio and Zelensky to Donald Trump failed to materialize, what you saw was the President of the United States trying to demonstrate to the American people that this is not a man who wants to end the war. And as such, he's not someone that America can deal with. And in that regard, for the most part, Trump's response was actually fairly measured. I thought it was bad theater for the White House. I thought it was embarrassing in some ways that it was kind of a brats fighting in the sandbox. But it was Donald Trump's way of saying, you came on one pretext. You know that the United States was never going to again encourage your participation in NATO, but because your ongoing conflict with Russia would guarantee a war between Russia and the United States, which would go nuclear. So that is really foolish. It's not going to happen. And we're not going to continue to arm you so that you're not interested in ending this war with Russia. And so that was the purpose of Trump's news conference, which I think could have been said much better. And as it would turn out, Trump actually said it much better later that afternoon on the way to Marine One as he was preparing to fly to Mar-a-Lago in Florida for an event. He was exceedingly articulate as to why Zelensky was not a partner for peace and why the United States could not continue to work with him under these circumstances. Now, all of that said, I am non-political and therefore apolitical would probably be the best term. So I'm not taking a political side here. I just want you to know the facts and I want you to have an overview as to what happened yesterday. Because as I engage in X this morning, what I find is that maybe 5% of those participating have some knowledge of how we got into this place, but no one has the whole story. And some 95% of the people are simply yelling at one side or the other. So let's begin. In the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, the facts are actually irrefutable, and they are readily accessible. I began covering this war, it wasn't even a war at the time, but the impending war in the Ukraine some, I'd say 17 or 18 years ago. At the time, I was hosting a radio program, the aforementioned Shattering Myths, 3 hours, 5 days a week. And the events at the time began with a tussle between the IMF, backed by the United States, and the Russians, backed by the pro-Russian government that had been elected in Ukraine, for who was going to fund the Ukrainian inability to manage their government because graft was such a major issue in Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine is the most graft-ridden nation in that region of the world. And because they have such enormous pilfering of federal and other funds without an annual loan from either the IMF or the Russians, the country is bankrupt. And the reason that Russia was in a position to fund the Ukraine and the United States was not is because the Russians had built pipelines through Ukraine at the time that the Ukraine was part of Russia. And those pipelines were from the Caspian Sea oil and gas reserve areas into Europe. And so just now that Ukraine was independent of Russia, Russia had to pay the Ukraine a fee for using their own pipeline across Ukrainian territory. And if the Ukrainians didn't pay their interest on the loans, they didn't pay their loans back, they could deduct those fees from the transit fees on the pipeline. So the Russians were in a sound position to be able to do this. The United States was not. They had nothing to rely on. So it would strictly be the IMF being used by the United States for regime change. Because if it was U.S. money, it put the U.S. in positions where it could dictate the outcome in the Ukraine. And I spoke to this at the time on the radio program because I recognized that this was a foolish idea for the United States. It was a foolish idea for the IMF. And I studied the history of graft in the Ukraine, and it is egregious. The other thing that I noticed before all of this wound up into war, going back now 16, 17 years in my radio reporting, is that the Ukraine had in fact been, as Russia described it, in the sense of Nazified. Prior to the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany and the Nazi Party, the Ukrainians were even more anti-Semitic, and their pogroms against Jews were far worse than were those that took place in Germany. And they were, well, for a very long time, they've had fascist influences throughout that country and militias that are neo-fascist militias. And during the Second World War, the Ukraine was the most active participant in bludgeoning Jews, and their history of doing so is, well, almost as egregious as the Muslims in doing it. So it was not a good place. I also learned that Hasidic Judaism, which is the most parasitic and degrading form of Judaism, was actually born in the Ukraine, and in that I am opposed to Hasidic Judaism. That did not bode well in terms of my evaluation. So this was the stage that was set, and I began reporting on the things that were happening in the Ukraine while I was doing my news analysis. What happened next was that George W. Bush, who I knew reasonably well, I had been in his home, I had spent many hours with him privately, one-on-one. I did not like him. In fact, I disrespected him. because I knew from his own lips that if elected president, and he was totally unqualified for the job, that he was going to get the United States into a war because he wanted to be a wartime president. He told me as much. So it was obvious what he was going to do. And it was obvious that he was not a very bright man. It was George Bush on April of 2008 who lit the fuse in Kiev by announcing that Ukraine would be part of NATO, which is similar to putting missiles in Cuba. I will read from an article that was written at that meeting at that time so that you have a gist of these events. George Bush this morning said he strongly supported Ukraine's attempt to join NATO and warned that he would not allow Russia to veto its membership bid. Speaking in Kiev after a meeting with Ukraine's President Viktor Yushchenko, the U.S. president said that both post-Soviet Ukraine and Georgia should be allowed to join the alliance, despite vehement objections from Russia. Well, the reason that Russia had these, and I'll return to this article in a moment, vehement objections to all of this is, again, because the same reason the United States had vehement objections to a strong military presence of Russia in Cuba, so close to the United States border. There's no buffer zone, no time to react. And one thing most people don't know about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that Russia wasn't the devious one in that affair. It was actually the United States. And it is so poorly understood that it's worth mentioning at this point. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not instigated by the Russians deciding to put missiles in Cuba. It was instigated by the foolishness of including Turkey and NATO so that U.S. nuclear missiles could be positioned alongside Russia and the Soviet Union at the time in Turkey. And so the Russian response was the only response the United States would heed, because through diplomatic channels, the United States was belligerent and it would not remove those nuclear weapons from the Turkish-Russian border regions. And therefore, the Russians had no choice but to deploy nuclear weapons in Cuba. So the settlement for all of this, when Khrushchev and Kennedy negotiated the terms, is always published in America as Kennedy got Khrushchev to blink and to remove those weapons with an agreement from the United States that it would never again invade Cuba. But there was far more to the story. You see, that deal was actually exactly what Russia was trying to achieve, which is the removal of ballistic missiles from their border with Turkey, which is what actually resolved the crisis. World War III was averted because politicians, much smarter than we have today, much more moral, removed the threat. So it's important that you know that, because we're playing this game again, but now with idiots. So George Bush, in saying that he wanted, was saying strongly supported the inclusion of Ukraine into NATO, which exists to be a threat to Russia. And that's why NATO exists. It is the post-World War II U.S. and Europe, Western Europe threat to Russia. And it calls for, demands that if any one nation is attacked, that all nations have to come to that nation's defense. So if the Ukraine was part of NATO and there was a Russian invasion, the United States would have to send troops and weapons and declare war against Russia, which would lead directly to World War III and a nuclear holocaust. So what George Bush did was unbelievably stupid. fact, I saw a picture today of him there with Condoleezza Rice and his Dick Cheney. I mean, just the maestros of evil, Rumsfeld. It just gave me the creeps to see that group gathered in the White House for all the chicanery that they imposed on the world. And it bothers me a great deal, too, because of that other subject, because it was George Bush that forced Israel to withdraw from Gaza that led to what happened on 10/7 of 23, something that he has never apologized for. So here we are with the United States saying that not only is Ukraine going to be part of NATO, George Bush is there in Kiev making the announcement, and he says that he didn't give a crap whether Russia hates it or not. He was not going to allow Russia to veto that maneuver. And so he was essentially pledging the world, to World War III. The story goes on to say, in remarks likely to infuriate the Kremlin, Bush said Ukraine would be invited during this week's NATO summit in Bucharest to join NATO's membership action program, a prelude to full membership. He also said that there would be no deal with Moscow over the U.S. administration's contentious plans to locate elements of its controversial missile defense system in Ukraine and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. George Bush is the one who lit the flame to the Russian-Ukrainian war. Make no mistake, and it is proven if you just understand history. Well, it gets far worse. Next, the Obama administration, working with the CIA, funded, armed, and supported the overthrow of the pro-Russian elected government. Validating this, a U.S. State Department's communication on regime change dated to January 2014, a month before the protests and the Ukraine, armed with U.S. weapons that the CIA had supplied, became bloody. And because of the bloody conflict, the pro-Russian elected government was overthrown. Well, this cable, voice cable, from the U.S. State Department to its Ukrainian ambassador was made public in the first week of February 2014, which was still 3 weeks before the elected government fell. And I quote from a news source contemporaneous with this event, in case, well, everyone seems to have missed it. A conversation between a State Department official and U.S. ambassador to Ukraine was posted on YouTube. It revealed an embarrassing exchange on U.S. strategy for the overthrow of the government in that country, including a crude American swipe at the European Union. The leaked conversation bolstered charges from Russia, among others, that the Ukrainian opposition to the elected pro-Russian government is being manipulated by Washington. It wasn't just an accusation, it was absolute proof of this. U.S. accusations that Russia exposed the tape conversation of its officials also threatened Washington's already tense relationship with Moscow. The audio clip gained wide circulation, showing Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland. This is not some low-life individual, career politician in the State Department with no authority. This is the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland. She was weighing in vocally on the makeup of the next Ukrainian government, just as the revolution turned bloody, and a month before the elected government was overthrown by U.S. influence. Now, if that doesn't make your skin crawl, to know the United States was the sponsor of regime change. We overthrew the elected government. Now you hear all of these, both leftist and rightist political pundits say, we stand with democracy in Ukraine against the dictatorship in Russia. When in fact, it was the United States that deliberately and knowingly, purposefully overthrew the elected government of the Ukraine so that it could start a proxy war with Russia. Those are the facts. They are not in dispute. Your ignorance of those facts does not change their reality, no matter what your political persuasion might be. The United States was instrumental in overthrowing the elected government of the Ukraine, which then put all of this mess into a fait accompli, which has now cost 1.2 million lives. It's not just a little political blunder, and put the world on a collision course for World War III. Newland is heard on this call telling U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, that she didn't think that Vitaly Klitschko, the boxer turned politician, who is a main opposition leader, should be in the new government. That's really funny with Ukraine. You had the boxer turned politician, and he was followed by the chocolate magnate turned politician, and now we have the former clown and comedian turned politician. I mean, you wouldn't believe this story if somebody turned in a screenplay and I say, I'm going to tell you, make a comedy of how 1.2 million people have died and been critically injured, and how the world squandered $500 billion in the process of taking the world to the precipice of nuclear destruction, with a boxer turned politician followed by a chocolate magnate turned politician followed by a clown and comedian turned politician, while the world all screamed platitudes against Russia. But that's where we find ourselves. So Newland tells Ambassador Jeffrey Piat that she doesn't think that Vitaly Klitschko, the boxer turned politician, who is the main opposition leader, should be in the new government. Now, what in the world is the United States doing, orchestrating this coup and then determining who should run the government? This is a quote from that call. So I don't think that Klitsch should go into the government, she said in the recording, which described events that occurred in late January 2014. I think it's necessary. I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think it's a good idea. The United States loves to play kingmaker, but every time we do it, it blows up in our face. Separately, this was reported on Thursday of events that were taking place this week. The story I'm sharing with you is contemporaneous to these events in early February of 2014. So it reads separately on Thursday, a senior Kremlin aide accused the United States of arming Ukrainian rebels, which we did. The United States did that very thing. That's how the Ukrainian revolution turned bloody, because the peaceful protests were not enough, and warned Russia would intervene to maintain the security of its neighbor. The United States didn't care. That's what the U.S. wanted, was a proxy war with Russia. U.S. officials, while declining to confirm the recording's contents, didn't dispute its authority. And I quote, "I did not say that it was not authentic," State Department spokesperson Jen Pulaski said at a news briefing. "I did not say that it was not authentic." Matter of fact, she would go on to say that this is what diplomats do, you know. Of course, it was their voices, easily proven that it was their voices. And the Russians caught them barehanded. Therefore, the only rational conclusion that can be drawn from the evidence is that the U.S. lit the fuse by determining that the Ukraine would not only be part of NATO and a threat to Russia, but that it would also deploy U.S. weapons against Russia in 2008 under the Bush administration, and then played a decisive role in overthrowing the elected government of the Ukraine because it was pro-Russian in 2014. It only gets worse. You might say, no, can't get any worse than that, right? Yeah, it does. Next, we see John McCain in a February 2014 video where he's standing in a room overlooking the square in Ukraine where U.S. taxpayer money and weapons were deployed to overthrow the democratically elected government, and he's there smirking and filming it on his cell phone. He is celebrating the very protest that the U.S. orchestrated. And there he is with his smirk. And I know the man smirk well. John McCain is a politician that I actually got to know fairly well. I flew him to events in my airplane, and I had him to my home. I have been in his home. I've been in his office in Washington, D.C. I've spent considerable time with him. There were aspects of the man's life that I liked, and there were aspects that I did not. And this is one that I did not. Then in December of 2016, and before I say this, once again, surely, can't get worse than that, right? Oh, but it does. Oh, it does it ever. Then in December of 2016, more than 5 years before the war began in February of 2022, Senators John McCain and Senator Lindsey Graham are on video in Ukraine telling the Ukrainians that the U.S. and Ukraine would start a war fighting against Russia, beginning in the Donbass region where there were almost 1 million ethnic Russians, with the U.S. promising to supply the weapons. Your war will be our war. Our war will be your war. We will back you for however long it takes, these men said to the Ukrainians. I have posted that video, and video is easily discovered on YouTube. I have posted it on my X account. I have posted it on my Facebook account. Now it is going to also be on the YouTube accounts. If you have not seen this video with these U.S. senators declaring a proxy war against Russia, filmed 5 years prior to the Russian response, well, you really ought to watch it before you say anything further about this conflict or decide whose side you're on, where democracy really stands, who started this war. Because it's one of the most embarrassing bits of video you'll ever watch. On the same trip, Republican Senators Lindsey Graham and John McCain spent the new year in Kiev, where Petro Poroshenko gave them both state medals. Yeah, the Order of the Ukraine. They were later pictured with a group of military men drawn from units engaged in the, genocidal, really, anti-democratic war against the people of Donbass, in which had become even more violent in the weeks preceding their visit, with Kiev continually violating the Minsk II agreements. The senators were trying to bestow international legitimacy onto what it was blatantly neo-fascist, I would say genocidal, regimes that reigned in the Ukraine. And they were already battling ethnic Russians in the Donbass region with the United States support and encouragement, because these two men wanted to continue the Cold War. No other reason. They despised Russia because they were old Cold Warriors and they longed for the good old days. And part of the reason, too, most people don't know this connection, but Lindsey Graham ran against Donald Trump when he ran for the Republican nomination, when he ran against Hillary Clinton. And at the time, the Republican that was most annoying to Donald Trump was John McCain. It is why, well, I'll share this with you in a moment. So there was a lot boiling over in the White House that had been simmering from a very long time, and that had a lot to do with things that preceded the arrogance of Zelensky, thinking that he didn't have to honor the agreement that he had come to sign, which was the mineral rights agreement, and that he could talk over Donald Trump and impose his will and get the American people to side with him to have his nation join NATO, which would have been suicidal. There's a lot that was simmering behind the scenes. And that is because the two senators that I have mentioned, Lindsey Graham and John McCain, had a great personal dislike for Donald Trump that was brewing as Donald Trump, because this is all during the time that Donald Trump was elected and became president in his first term. And it was McCain who was taunted by Trump, who said that he prefers his war heroes who don't get caught, which was a reference to McCain's period as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. And later, he went on to call McCain a dummy. Graham, and that was because McCain was really not much of a Republican. He much preferred really a very different approach to politics. And if you recall, going back, the mainstream of the Republican Party, too, hated Trump. You know, Trump in his first term was a grassroots movement against the base of the Democratic Party. George Bush hated him. The whole Bush clan hated them. And Lindsey Graham did. The stalwarts of the Republican Party have despised Trump. They just finally became more silent because what they have learned is that Trump's base trumps theirs. So this is part of the animosity pursuant to Ukraine that was brewing. And what Graham and McCain were trying to do is they were trying to stop what Donald Trump was trying to reset the relationship with Russia. He had a special term for it. Operation Cooperation is what he called it. And they didn't want that. They were Cold Warriors. They wanted Russia to be the enemy. Russia didn't want to be the enemy, and but they did. And so their grudges against Donald Trump and their grudges against Russia was largely why this duo waged this propaganda war, which they were exceedingly successful at waging this propaganda war in the mainstream media, because the mainstream media was so anti-Trump that the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of mentality. They ran with the false narratives that Lindsey Graham and John McCain were spewing. And it was interesting that those who were close to John McCain came out yesterday to denounce Lindsey Graham, who sided with Trump now because he's learned his lesson, against Zelensky, saying that how could he betray what he had stood for when he was calling for this war against Russia 6 years before it started. So although the U.S. mainstream media coverage of the Ukrainian events from the coup to the war in Donbass were woeful and biased, the coverage finally became so sparse that most Americans were drawn into not only the conflict between Israel and the Muslims in Gaza, but also to all of the other theater around it, and to the alliance between progressives and Muslims to oppose the state of Israel. Now, moving on to the next phase of this, Biden also played his role. So this was a bipartisan effort. If you go through from Bush to McCain and Graham to the Obamanator, and then to Weekend at Bernie's with the comatose Biden. He played his role, refusing to back down on weaponizing the Ukraine by their inclusion in NATO. I remember when we were first hearing this, and I kept on hearing Biden say that we will not back down. We're not going to exclude Ukraine's entry into NATO. We're not going to discourage their inclusion into the European Union. Well, Russia just needs to shut up and sit down. And he was doing it when Russia made it so clear that if you don't back down on this, if you try to include Ukraine in NATO and weaponize it, then we have no choice but to invade. And so when the United States stopped listening to Russia's words, Russia positioned its troops around the eastern part of the Ukrainian border and say, I'm going to give you a month. Back down. Back off. Or there's going to be war. And rather than negotiating with Russia, rather than saying, this is really a dumb idea, well, we're not going to do that. No one needs this war. Biden doubled down, became even more vicious against Russia, and then began to sanction everything you can imagine in Russia and stealing Russian assets all over the world. And positioned it as Russia was the aggressor, knowing full well that wasn't true. It is one of those situations where, the old line, you can fool some of the people all of the time, all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all of the time. Well, in this case, both with the Fakistinians and claiming that they have been ousted from their state of Fakistan, and this whole mess of Russia being the aggressor in the Ukraine, is indeed all of the people have been fooled most all of the time. We made war inevitable. It was the Cuban Missile Crisis played by absolute immoral idiots who then, after they caused this war, robbing 1.2 million people of their lives and pushing us to the precipice of nuclear holocaust, all they would do is lie. I have no respect for any of them. This war has to end. Well, if that were not enough, America, as we now know, and throughout the media, if you even presented any of these elements that I'm sharing with you, which are irrefutable, they're just simply truth, you were called a Putin sympathizer. Now, I don't give a rat's ass about Putin. Putin is a man who only cares about one thing, and it isn't Putin, it's Russia. He's very popular in Russia because of that. And Putin has done some things recently in terms of his stances against Israel and his stances in favor of Islamic terrorism and his outreach to both China for weapons and for the Ukraine for weapons, which means there's a quid pro quo here where he's supplying nuclear technology to the Iranians, is indeed troublesome. But whose fault is that? Would he have done any of those things if, rather than peacefully coexisting and working politically and economically with Russia, which is what Russia wanted, we didn't go to war with Russia and sanction Russia. We put Russia in a position where they had no other option but to do this. And the consequence was the further development of the Iranian nuclear program, which was suicidal for the world and likely to cause the next world war as a result of that. So there were ramifications of George Bush's and Lindsey Graham's and John McCain's, Barack Obama's, Joe Biden's stupidity. So fanning the flames of war, the U.S. allies gave Ukraine $500 billion in weapons to kill Russians, of whom 1 million Russians were killed or seriously wounded, probably 200,000 or 300,000, maybe Ukrainians. We really don't know the overall numbers. Certainly it's in the hundreds of thousands on both sides were killed and severely wounded. In fact, there really is no fight left in the Ukrainian military because they've been in war at too long. They haven't allowed those who were initially conscripted to leave the combat zone. They're not properly supplied. It's just a death trap for them. And the weapons that are being used against Russia are uncivilized. We're supplying cluster bombs to Russia, the same kind of weapons that the United States used in Iraq. It's unfathomable that we would do these kinds of things, but we have. And we have provided all manner of anti-tank weapons to take out Russian tanks and drones and you name it. So when people brag and say, "Yeah, who would have thought Putin never would have thought that the Ukraine could have ground him to a situation where there is no victor, a stalemate." But 500 billion buys a lot of weapons. The U.S. and Europe have emptied the storehouses of weapons to wage war with Russia, and part of all of this too is the realization there never was a potential for a favorable outcome, and that's one of the things I hold against nations. Like when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, it was a really bad situation there, much of which the United States is guilty of creating when Zbigniew Brzezinski rented the Taliban by bribing the Pakistani government with advanced weapons so that we could fight a proxy war against Russia in Afghanistan. And it led to the formation of Al-Qaeda, which then attacked America on 9/11. We do some really stupid things without thinking through what the consequence is going to be. We deposed Saddam Hussein when, even though he was an evil man, he was the most pro-Western dictator amongst Muslim nations. Well, he was because the Shah of Iran was ousted by Jimmy Carter. And what did we get for ousting the Shah of Iran? We got the Ayatollah Khomeini and the devastating effect for the Iranian people and for the world. The United States decided that Muammar Gaddafi was a bad guy. Yeah, it probably was. But what we got instead of him after deposing him was a gang of hoodlums and Islamic jihadists. The United States, and it was largely John McCain, who formed alliances with all manner of Islamic State terrorists and Muslim mujahideen to overthrow the Assad regime because, well, the Assad regime was buying their weapons from Russia. That made them bad. So we started the Syrian civil war, which caused the migration of millions of Syrians into Europe, which changed the political climate of Europe forevermore. We just don't think of the consequence. And now in Syria, that Assad, who was a very bad man, has been overthrown. You have the Islamic State in charge of Syria, which is far worse. Every time we do something, we invaded Iraq because we decided that Iraq bad because Iraq wanted to invade and take over Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, which actually would have been good for the United States because he was a secular leader and they were fundamentalist Muslim leaders, and they were the ones that funded not only 9/11, but they fund almost all of the most fundamentalist Islamic mosques in the world that fanned the flames of Islamic terrorism. And Saddam Hussein despised Islamic terrorists. And George Bush lied and said that, he was sponsoring Al-Qaeda and harboring Al-Qaeda, when in fact it was just the opposite. Saddam Hussein despised everything associated with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So we just lied and we went to war, sacrificing Americans' blood and coin, fighting a battle to protect the Saudi Arabians. It was utterly despicable, but of course, George Bush had received a lot of money from the Saudi Arabians, and, well, you know what we have to do when people are bribed. Regime change turned out so badly, though, because what happened after the U.S. invasion of Iraq is that because somehow Americans' military can't count, they wanted elections. And so when the 60% majority of Iraqis who are Shiite Muslims voted, they voted for Iranian Shiite clerics, and they united Iraq with Iran. The United States gave Iraq to Iran, which was the consequence of that invasion. All of the Americans died not only for nothing, but to make a bad situation infinitely worse. And that changed the entire political landscape and religious landscape of the Middle East, which has led to all of the carnage we have witnessed throughout. All because of George Bush's stupid decision. So the United States does this a lot. A lot. We use our military to make bad situations worse. We did it in Afghanistan. We did it in Iraq. We did it in Libya. We did it in Vietnam. We did it in North Korea. We make bad situations worse, and we do it around the world, and we do it quite often. And the Ukraine war is an example of that, although it's a proxy war in this particular occasion. And there is no end game, as I've said, because let's say that Russia finally prevails and they take over all of the Ukraine with all of at that point, it would have been more than $1 trillion worth of U.S. and European weapons. They squandering probably at that point of 2 or 3 million lives, destruction of the country, and a hatred that would boil over into another war between Russia and Europe and the United States for opposing it. That's not much of a favorable outcome. But then you go on the other side, and let's say that the $500 billion in U.S. and European weapons is matched with another $500 billion, and it's just too many deaths for Russia to take, and they began to push the borders back into Russia and use the long-range weapons that we have provided to attack, as they already have, Moscow and other Russian cities. The Russian response is going to be nuclear. And Putin has said as much. We ought to believe him. The response will be nuclear. So you cannot win. When winning in this becomes a nuclear holocaust, there is no winning. How could these dunderheads not have thought that through? So there just is no end game. This war has to stop. As I said, it's the Cuban Missile Crisis played by fools, with far too many misinformed idiots serving as cheerleaders for what will become World War III. Now, it's true that Trump, Vance, and Zelensky all demonstrated that they were unrestrained in their ability to conduct a news conference. But that news conference did actually follow the meetings. And it was Zelensky who failed everyone, including his own people. And it put Trump in a position where he wanted to prove that you can't do this. And unfortunately, the part that is now played around the world is Trump and Vance bullying Zelensky, when if you had listened to the news conference that Trump held on the walk to Marine One as he left the White House that day, you would have heard him say, we can't do business with a man that doesn't want peace. This war must end. Trump's right. The war must end. And the only way for this war to end is to negotiate with Russia, since we instigated this war with Russia. And so long as Zelensky is provided with weapons, he will not end this war. He wants to continue it. This war cannot continue. And Trump made that crystal clear. We cannot continue to supply him with weapons. Now, does it help with all the name calling? No. Is any of that beneficial? Absolutely not. It degrades the office of president and the White House. But he's right in that Zelensky is a warmonger here. Zelensky has also got his hands in the cookie jar. He's likely stealing as much as 5 to 10% of that money that has been provided to the Ukraine. And his generals are stealing the US and Europe blind as well. It is the nature of the Ukraine and their politics and their morality, and has been for a very long time. I don't speak that to be nasty to Ukrainians. I just tell you that that is a fact, and it's been known for a very long time. And you have to be very careful as to who you say you stand with and are allied with, or you could walk out with lice and fleas. And this is not a good situation. But when Trump simply explained on the way to Marine One, we have to defund and disarm Ukraine so that the Ukrainians are willing to negotiate a peace settlement with Russia. It needs to be done. And that has to start with a ceasefire. And that's what we wanted. That's not what he wanted. He was not willing to engage in a ceasefire. It has to happen in Ukraine. And then the solution is actually fairly simple. You say what Donald Trump has said. There can be no discussion of any kind about weaponizing the Ukraine going forward or Ukraine becoming part of NATO. That is a complete non-starter. It cannot occur. And the areas of high percentage ethnic Russians in Ukraine, like the Donbass region, that Russia already controls, they need to be controlled by Russia. It's less than 5% of the Ukrainian territory. And Crimea, that wants to be with Russia as well, should be allowed to be with Russia. And then all the sanctions need to be lifted, and they must sign an agreement that says that at this point they'll stop warring with each other. The Ukraine maintains 95% of its territory, and the bloodletting stops. That's the answer. If your ego won't allow you to come to that answer, then somehow you need to come to grips with how the United States started this in the first place. So you need to deal with that. So that's the program that I wanted to deliver to you. I'm not bringing this to you as a proponent for a political party. As you heard, I'm opposed to both. This has been a bipartisan blunder by the United States from the beginning, and it needs to end. And it needs to end now, because there is no outcome here that is even in the least bit favorable. And so I wanted you to know the truth. I wanted you to know things that are irrefutable, and how with very little effort you can validate everything that I have told you. But if you're going to speak on this issue, if you're going to even hold an opinion on this issue that you're going to share with others, take the time to learn the truth. I am Craig Winn, and this has been a special edition of the YAHOWAH blog.